Lahore, Pakistan is a loud, bustling city of about 10 million. There's a family there, the Reza family, of a mom, a dad, and 3 adult sons. To me, they represent a microcosm of Pakistan. The eldest son has taken over his father's shop and turns to drugs to cope with the stress. The middle son is a terrorist. The youngest is a brilliant law student on scholarship. The parents, they're just praying everything stays together and clinging to the dream that was once Pakistan. Haroon Ullah is an American of South Asian descent. He's an author and a diplomat. He's written about the experiences of this family and the larger struggle for the soul of Pakistan. His book is called The Bargain from the Bazaar, and Haroon Ullah joins me in the studio. Haroon, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
This book is nonfiction, but it reads like a thriller. How much of this is made up?
Well, the whole thing is based on it's a true account of my entire time in Pakistan. I lived in Pakistan for 8 years. I lived with this family in Lahore, met them in 2004. They've seen a copy of it, and I try to, there's hundreds of interviews that went into sort of cataloging and trying to make sure that, I knew what was going through each of their minds and as accurate as possible. So this is, to my best ability, an accurate account of the transpiring of these remarkable events. As you noted, to me, I met countless number of families that dealt with these same issues.
And how did you meet this particular family?
So I went to Pakistan to do my doctoral work, and I was doing a project on the military, and I met actually Awais and Shez at a dinner party where he was actually...
These are the parents?
The parents. I met them, they were telling a story of, his POW stories of, sort of walking back, all across India back to Pakistan. He walked 1,000 miles, and I just caught my eye and I said, who would do that? Who and what would drive somebody? And I did a lot of work on the military. There's not a lot of POWs that you meet. There weren't that many from the 1971 war between India and Pakistan. And so it was fascinating me. And so I talked to him, got to know him, and got to know Shez, who I think she's this remarkable woman that's breaking all sorts of cultural barriers. She's the glue of the family, literally working day and night in a hospital. So yeah, that was part of the beginning of a journey of this remarkable family.
The middle son I mentioned in the introduction is a terrorist.
Mm-hmm.
His name is Daniel. Let's step back and ask, where and how did radical Islamic thought come into Pakistan?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in my first book, Vying for Allah's Vote, this is exactly the question that I tackled, which was, why do you see extremism in a place like Pakistan? And I actually spent, 2 years living in the northern areas near the Afghan-Pakistan border, the tribal regions. I used to go into camps. I interviewed Taliban commanders, Haqqani network commanders, terrorists from Lashkar-e-Taiba, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, these groups, to ask them that question. Why is it that young people get swept up? And, what I found was a few things. One of the big things I found is that it's really the thin middle class. It's young people, not the ones that are struggling with poverty, but it's actually young educated people from the universities, public universities, that were getting recruited. And for them, it was an identity and ideological grievance. They saw all this corruption around them. They saw all the problems of modern day Pakistan. And here was a group of people that was saying, we have an answer. We have a solution. And so the young people got swept up, oftentimes recruited into these groups because they thought this is how you can solve Pakistan's woes. And I think that's the big crux to me today, is that young people face those two choices.
And what about the role of Saudi Arabia and their Wahhabi ideology and their funding of these madrasas, the religious schools?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Mimi. I think that early on, in the 1980s and 90s, obviously a significant amount of funding came in during General Zia's time, and you found that the Deoband and Wahhabi brand was oftentimes pushed. They funded the Madaris system, funded schools. You found a lot of exchange of scholars going back and forth from the Gulf and Pakistan. It's actually, interestingly enough, the majority of funding now is from within Pakistan for these same Deoband madrasas. So if you fast forward 15 years, the influence is not as great as it was. I mean, there's still connections. There's still some funding that comes in, but mostly it's funded within Pakistan. And that it's actually these shrines. There's like a political economy of these shrines. They're like mini businesses. And I think of schools as, they're running a firm. They're competing for students because students equal capital. And so you find a lot of schools, you have over 24,000 religious schools and just in Pakistan alone. And so they're competing against each other for students. And so they have to offer certain competitive advantages or certain programs that differentiate them from others. And so you find it now internally funded.
But why would a parent send their child to one of these religious schools? I mean, you're not going to come out being a doctor or a pharmacist or...
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's two things. I mean, one is that for a lot of families, they want to have one of their children to study in the religious studies. You know, you oftentimes see
just
a
from
family,
piety.
From piety, you might have, you know, a family of 6 or 7. They say, we want to send one of our children to go and to study and, you know, to sort of represent the family in sort of izzat, as they say, sort of respect that they get from somebody studying the religious studies and sciences. And there's a sort of a reputational boost in the community if you have somebody that memorizes and as well, and you know, sort of gains that knowledge. And I think the other thing is that in some areas they are the best schools. You know, the public school system's in shatters. You know, and a lot of these families can't afford sending them to private schools. I mean, we're talking about people that 60% of the country makes under $2 a day.
The book we're discussing is called The Bargain from the Bazaar, A Family's Day of Reckoning in Lahore. Haroon Ullah is an author. He's a member of Secretary Kerry's policy planning staff at the State Department, and he specializes in South Asian affairs. The middle son, Daniel, attended one of these religious schools. Mm-hmm. Didn't that raise alarms within the family, given that he was starting to radicalize? And he was open about his beliefs.
That's right, absolutely. It raised huge alarm bells, you know, and that was actually, I saw a lot of the pain that the parents suffered. You know, these were middle-class parents that, you know, were spiritually grounded, did the right thing. They're, you know, providing everything for their kids, a better education, sacrificing everything. Actually, not too unlike families I grew up with. I grew up very blue collar in a very small town in eastern Washington state, a farming community. And, you know, that's what sort of struck me about Awais and Shez, is that they're very similar to people that grew up down my street. And so when they found out that, you know, their son is in this school, they used to oftentimes tell me, have we failed as parents? Could we have done anything differently? You know, did we do the right thing? You know, could we have gone back in time and changed things? And they would stay up late at night, and that was a very, very troubling thing for them.
Daniel, that son, said that he didn't need to go to any other school because all the education he needs comes from the Islamic religious texts. Mm-hmm. But that's ridiculous.
Yeah, he was swept up in this. We talked about earlier is that he is, you know, he's got swept up by these people that have sort of brainwashed and provided sort of a one package all sort of solution. And part of it's almost like a fraternity. So there's almost like a gang type atmosphere. It's a social support network. You know, you have friends, a peer network, and they provide them with all these amenities. And so he was swept up in that rhetoric.
So his father, Awais, says to him, he says, sometimes people go too far, beyond what Allah asks of us. But how do you define too far?
You know, I think that, you know, the parents, and in that instance, I think Awais is trying to find a way to pull him back, trying to find a way to...
But there's no defined stopping point. There's no point, you know, piety is good, you know, you're getting close to God, that's great. But then it starts to creep into, I have to represent Allah in cleaning up this place. I have to purify Pakistan. I have to establish an Islamic state.
Right. Yeah, and I think that, you know, in Pakistan, that's the fascinating thing, is that religion takes on something very different than even we think about here. You know, it's woven into so much symbolism in everyday life. And I think, you know, that's a great scene that you brought up, because I think Awais was trying to find a way to pull him back, try to find a way to say, look, we too also are spiritually grounded. We too, we're not making this sort of, I don't believe in God and you believe in God, but yet we're on the same side here. But the way that you think that you're representing is actually absolutely wrong. It goes against every tenet of Islam that we know. And they were trying to get through to him and saying that, look, God doesn't want you to do that. In fact, what you're doing angers God. What you're doing right now is exactly opposite of what those people are trying to brainwash you with.
The eldest son, Salman, was sitting with one of his friends, complaining about the current state of affairs. Then he says this, quote, I blame the Americans for a lot of our troubles. Mm-hmm. How did this become our fault?
You know, people there have long memories, and they think back to, you know, the 1970s, 1980s. They felt that, as Pakistanis, they think, and I oftentimes have heard this everywhere, where people love Americans, but they disagree with American policy. They love Americans. They love McDonald's. They love the food, the culture, the music.
They want to come to America.
They can't wait to come. I mean, the lines used to go out 2 miles long from the embassy, visa applications through the roof. This is still the land of opportunity. And yet they thought they held the wrong end of the stick after the Afghan war. For them, their memory is that after, they defeated the Russians, that Pakistan got stuck with 4 million refugees. And they calculated $20 billion in costs and instability in the northern areas, because there was a vacuum that got created after we left. And obviously, who filled that? The Taliban. And the Taliban were the freedom fighters of yesterday, right? We all remember when they were on the steps with President Reagan, hailed as freedom fighters. And so I think for Pakistanis, they think, look, this is transactional. You come and use us when you need us, but you're not here for the long run. And so that's why oftentimes they'll bring up it's the Americans' fault.
The same Salman also says this. He says, things were bad enough before, but ever since the Yankees came, everything has gotten a lot worse. A lot worse from when? I
think they see, the war on terror, after 9/11. Again, they see Pakistan, lots of people forget that Pakistan has lost over 50,000 people since 9/11 in terms of terrorism within Pakistan.
But they don't take responsibility for that themselves. I mean, this seems like a victim mentality of, it's always somebody else's fault. Let's blame America for this. Don't they realize that their government is supporting terrorism?
So yeah, I think, and that's a lot of the Pakistanis that I do, that met that actually do take responsibility. I think I met so many families, everyday people we don't hear from. And that was part of my inspiration to write this, was that there are a lot of families that, that we wouldn't see in the headlines that are they're on the front lines. Young people doing music and arts and culture that are fighting back against extremists. I worked with Malala for 2 years, before her tragedy. Young people like that I think are doing inspiring work. So, yeah, I think they are taking steps, and I also have to feel, I think the military is trying to, lost over 4,500 people fighting this in the northern areas. It's tough terrain. I mean, this is their Vietnam, and so if you joined the Pakistan military after 9/11, you've served at least 4 tours in very, very difficult terrain, fighting against your own countrymen.
The U.S. has spent somewhere about $18 billion in aid to Pakistan since 2002. What if we cut that all off? What would happen?
That's a great question. I think that from my point of view, I think that at the end of the day, what I see beneficial is the people-to-people contact, the people-to-people between America and Pakistan. We have the largest Fulbright program in the world. And I think public diplomacy works. I see this
Public diplomacy is not that expensive. It's not $18 billion.
Well, it's part of the overall effort, right? So USAID, we're putting English language programs, it's helping with dams, helping with the electricity issues in Pakistan. And I think it was trying to signal to the Pakistanis that it's more than just transactional. We're not just paying you to fight our war. We're not just paying you and, reimbursing you for military equipment while you go in the northern areas, but actually we're in it for the long haul for issues that are, that affect everyday Pakistanis. That energy blackouts and the dams and so that was the idea. That's what Richard Holbrooke and many that came through and tried to do that. And I think it's a worthy effort because Mimi, I get scared that, look, we've seen this movie before. Sure, we cut off the aid, and we did that in 1992. And what happened less than 10 years later? I mean, this place is still the most dangerous place in the world. You still have recruitment going through the roof. You have people that want to attack us.
Haroon, it's the Islamic extremists hate us, obviously. The liberal elites don't like us. The shopkeepers don't like us. You read this book and it's like nobody likes us. I just feel like we need to tweak our foreign policy there. Something's wrong. I mean, we do all this, we spend the money, and they hate us.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, there's a lot, but I think you have to go beyond that a little bit. It's not that there's a misperceptions on both sides. So, in Pakistan, you're right. They are paranoid. They think conspiracy theory. They think everything's our fault. They don't realize all the good that both the U.S. and international stakeholders are doing. But the misperception is also here in the U.S. I go around now talking about Pakistan. Pakistan's become a bad word. People are like, if you saw the latest Pew poll, over half of Americans said they do not want somebody of Pakistani heritage as a neighbor. I'm talking about Pakistani Americans as a neighbor. And so, I think the misperceptions are heavy on both sides. And I think it's up to people like us to sort of build those bridges, because look, it wasn't always like this. I mean, I still remember, you can look back at the pictures and videos, and I meet people, Jackie Kennedy going down the streets of Lahore, treated as a queen. You have President Eisenhower going to a cricket match in Pakistan. You have Nixon on the back of a truck.
But that's before the big radicalization of the population.
Right. And I think that always won't be the case. I mean, I think Pakistan's too important to ignore. Fourth most populous country in the next 15 years. I think that, we have to stay engaged, not just for our own national security, because it's so important geostrategically. I mean, I think that there's so much for us to also be gained in Pakistan.
But how do we get the Pakistani government to stop playing this double game of taking money from us, saying that we're allies, yet supporting the Taliban and supporting the extremists?
So, I mean, I take a little different view. I think that the Pakistani government doesn't support the Taliban. I mean,
directly.
Right, or indirectly. I mean, I really believe that, they've been doing operations against the Taliban. I sincerely believe that the military is trying to root them out. You've had the chief of army staff has said, this is our internal problem now. It's a big shift in the Pakistan military.
What about the ISI? I mean, aren't they funneling support and aid to them?
Well, not that I know of, and you might know more than I do in reading those reports. But from my point of view, this is an internal issue that they now are suffering, and they also want to root it out. They don't know what to do with this scourge. It's almost like a monster that's been created, and they don't know how to deal with it. And so I think that they're trying to build the political will to continue this fight, but they're also worried about this summer and the potential, ramifications in Afghanistan.
Haroon Ullah is my guest. He's in the studio with me. He's a member of Secretary Kerry's policy planning staff at the State Department. He's the author of the book called The Bargain from the Bazaar, A Family's Day of Reckoning in Lahore. You're listening to The Mimi Gerges Show. We're on the web at mgshow.org. Kamran is the youngest son. He's a law student. He wants to change Pakistan. Is that where Pakistan's hope lies? Would he and others like him be able to do that?
Absolutely. I mean, I still remain cautiously optimistic about Pakistan's future. And it's because of people I met, like Kamran, young people that did the lawyers movement in 2007 out on the streets. These are young people that are educated, that want a different Pakistan. I was an election observer last year for the 2013 elections, watershed elections, highest ever turnout, nearing about 57%. I saw young people, older people, people that never voted before. And you found that, they voted for fairly centrist parties, but that kind of it's the first ever democratic handover in Pakistan's history. And so I am cautiously optimistic because I think there's young people that are doing this heroic work, fighting back against the extremists in their own country. And I think that at the end of the day, they just need a platform.
But some of those educated Pakistanis, and I'm thinking about some of Kamran's law school classmates, say what they need is a pure Islamic state and that would solve all their problems.
Mm-hmm. I know, and that's the debate that goes on within Pakistan, is that they feel that, there's still this internal dialogue. Should we go towards an Islamic state? Should we not? But I think the people, you look at what they voted. You haven't ever had an Islamic party win national government. And I think people realize that. They want actually a different Pakistan that's democratic, that can just govern better.
Haroon, there was a bombing at a Sufi Muslim shrine in Lahore, Pakistan. When did that happen? Who was responsible? Why did they do it?
There's over the last few years, that's been the remarkable change in Pakistan, is that the attacks are coming to the urban centers. They're coming to the shrines. I mean, when I was in Pakistan over 15 years ago, visiting and doing work, you never saw that. You never saw the violence coming to cities. You didn't see the sort of the bazaars, like Anarkali, which is this amazing historical microcosm of Pakistan, the oldest surviving marketplace in South Asia, over 350 years old. Never would you find someone bombing that. And the same with the shrines, like Dada Darbar, which is the one that you're referring to in Lahore, which is this like very iconic, shrine. It's almost like, the Washington Monument here in D.C., where people pay homage and go and, celebrate the architecture and the history. And so, yet now the extremists are coming to the cities. They are bombing the integral institutions, the marketplaces, the shrines. And I think that's also, woken a lot of people up that say, wow, this problem is not just something that happens in the northern areas. that those people have to deal with. This is now affecting my family, my community, my extended family. And I think that's what's also inspiring people to say, we have to fight back at all costs.
And the extremists consider the Sufis not real Muslims. So that's fair game. I mean, they say that they're the ones distorting Islam and we need to get rid of them and purify our society.
Yeah, and they're attacking the Sufis. They're also attacking Shia. They're attacking religious minorities, the Christian communities that I worked with very closely in Lahore and other places. They're attacking other Ahmadiyya, the other minorities. I mean, and so what's happening is that they're trying to define a very narrow vision, extreme version of what Pakistan is. And you find young people now, again, on the front lines using social media to fight back. You found a lot of like really interesting, critiques of the Taliban coming out in music. In this really renaissance Lahore Literary Festival, which is a festival for art and music and books. 50,000 people came about 2 months ago, over 4 days. So it's remarkable. We had Indian authors, American authors there. And so that, to me, I think is the hope in Pakistan, is that these young people fight against these extremists.
Gul Nawaz, a terrorist mastermind. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about him and why the Pakistani government can't seem to catch him.
So he's like a lot of these terrorist commanders, well-versed, battle-hardened, has seen conflict, revels in conflict, and likes to motivate young people as guerrillas, as extremists, and has used a perversion of Islam, to motivate young people. Part of, I think, is that there's not the capacity in the Pakistani, there's not the capacity and the full will in the Pakistani government and institutions to fight back. They are very weak institutions around the country. The military is the strongest institution, but the military is not the ones that are carrying out internal operations. It's the police. And that's where you find the collusion oftentimes.
And corruption.
And the corruption and everything else. So, and that's precisely why you find a lot of international stakeholders trying to help build capacity in Pakistani institutions, because what we don't want to see is Pakistan to slip further down the line and to become sort of, a basket case where then the extremists would take over.
One of the quotes you have in your book is from the Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, and he says, quote, "We all know the epicenter of terrorism in the world today is Pakistan. The world community has to come to grips with this harsh reality." Do you agree with that? Is it the epicenter of terrorism?
I think it's one of the main areas of focus. I think it's clearly, I think Pakistan represents, probably one of the greatest, challenges to sort of global stability because of what's happening in southern Punjab, because of what I think people have taken an eye off of what's going on in Pakistan because of Syria, because of what's going on in Egypt and the Middle East, now Ukraine. I think that's why, it's so important to remain engaged with Pakistan on all the dimensions, not just security, because I don't think you can tackle terrorism by simply, focusing on a narrow counterterrorism. You have to look at it in terms of building capacity of institutions and providing the necessary services for so many of the communities. So I agree with a lot of that statement. I think that it's so important. And India is such a critical piece of potentially helping move Pakistan forward.
Obviously Pakistanis are very deeply religious people, and you talked about how a lot of them are really trying to push back. But what are they doing to take Islam back from the extremists on the ideological level?
I met so many different scholars that have come out and, are getting more vocal. In Pakistan, there's called the Ittihad Tanzim al-Madaris, which are I like to think of them as the Billy Grahams of Pakistan. They are coming out and oftentimes making a stand, criticizing what the extremists do, criticizing what the Taliban do at great costs. I know many.
But on the ideological level, in other words, saying, you say the Quran says this, mm-hmm. but what it really means is this.
Exactly, yeah. They come out and said suicide bombing is wrong, absolutely wrong.
Based on
the Quran and the teachings. They've said, look, this extremist violence is antithetical to the tenets of Islam. And they've not just said things, but they've done things. I know many scholars that are holding Christmas celebrations in their mosques. They are the ones, and I think at the end of the day, that faith-based engagement is going to be very key. People forget that, In Pakistan, the best schools were set up by Christian missionaries. And they still are today. The St. Mary's, the St. Patrick's, the Foreman Christian College, this fantastic school in Lahore. And so I think that, that kind of faith-based engagement to me holds the most upside, because who are the credible key influencers in communities? They're religious leaders. And so they have to take a stand. And if they don't, then Pakistan's got a very dark future.
Obviously Daniel gets involved in a terrorist plot. He's trained. He's becomes a suicide bomber. And, I was hoping that he would have a change of thought, change of heart before he actually carried it out. But he did, in fact, carry out a suicide bombing. Obviously, the family is very devastated, not just because they lost their son, but because he killed others.
That's right.
How did the community react to them after that suicide bombing?
Very difficult. I mean, it was a very trying time, because the community lost people in that attack. It was a huge shame for the family. And I think that's what struck me, was that Awais and Shez, despite this incredible tragedy on so many levels, a son that they felt they failed with, to see the shame and the carnage that he had created around those in the community and the innocent people that lost their lives. And yet they found a way to hold together. They found a way to move on day to day. Most families would crumble. I would probably crumble. And that's why I thought this is a story of triumph and resilience, because they found a way, dug down deep, to sort of find a way to sort of, continue moving on. And so and I met a lot of families that, a lot of violence goes on in Pakistan, a lot of chaos. And yet these families, are able to find a way to continue moving on day to day. And I think that's a story that needs to be told.
Yet the lesson I took from this book is that Pakistan is a pressure cooker and that it can blow at any minute. Do you agree?
I mean, I think that's one of the things that, that faces Pakistan. I mean, I think, as you point out, Pakistan's at a crossroads. You have a very young population. As I said, 60, 70% of the country under the age of 30. That's 100 million youth. You have a tenuous political situation that's very fractured. And you have two choices. Do they choose a path of, education, entrepreneurship, looking for alternative pathways, or do they go down this path that the extremists have laid out and that are trying to recruit them? And I think that's the big choice. And I still remain cautiously optimistic, because I see enough young people going in this direction and that are doing the kind of heroic work. And so, yes, Pakistan still has the suicide bombings. I've lost many close friends. I've been involved. I've been in a market what's got bombed. So I've felt it. I felt what it feels like when you don't know if you're safe everywhere you go. And yet these families do that every day. And they find a way to continue trying to look on the bright side, trying to make a better Pakistan, not just for them, but for their kids.
Haroon Ullah, he's an author, a member of Secretary Kerry's policy planning staff at the State Department, specializing in South Asian affairs. The book is The Bargain from the Bazaar, A Family's Day of Reckoning in Lahore. Haroon, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks so much for having me. Quite an honor.